Professor Hojo.
The test results were within expectations. The specimen is somewhat lacking compared to her pure-blood mother, but for our purposes, she should more than suffice.
Although not the primary antagonist of Final Fantasy VII, Professor Hojo still remains perhaps the main catalyst in setting up the game's plot, and understanding his role will aid us in gaining useful insight into the overall world and story. This is Simon from Gamer Guides, and today we are taking a deep dive into the Final Fantasy VII villain, Professor Hojo. Before we delve further into Hojo's character, we must first establish some groundwork that will aid us in understanding some of the much needed context. And in order to do that, we need to head back 2,000 years, give or take, when the planet was occupied by a race known as the Cetra, and they were not particularly pleased by the fact that an alien entity came crashing down, they called it the Calamity from the Sky, and decided to use up the planet's resources for itself. This led to a battle between the extraterrestrial entity and the Cetra, which culminated in the alien being captured and quarantined, although not before the Cetra were almost wiped out by it. And that's because the alien had the ability to shapeshift into the Cetra in order to deceive them and almost defeat them. Regardless, the last few remaining Cetra did manage to band together, and with a little team spirit were able to quarantine the alien deep in the northern crater. That is the place that it originally came crashing down to the planet. Okay, right, zip forward about 2,000 years and enter the Shinra Electric Power Company, a mega corporation that exerts full control over every corner of society, from electricity to the military, politics, heck, even space exploration. You name it, they probably own it. And a large part of their success was owed to the fact that they discovered how to turn Mako, which is a condensed form of the planet's natural life stream flow, into a harvestable source of energy. The Shinra, wanting even more power, began to learn about the Cetra and their quest for the Promised Land, and they decided to continue on with the same journey because they believed this mythical Promised Land would be a place that was filled to the brim with Mako. More Mako means more energy, and more energy means more power. Not only the electric type of power, but the governing type of power as well.
With her we speak, her flesh we shape. Unto her promised land shall we one day return.
So about 30 years before the events of the original Final Fantasy VII, Shinra were out and about trying to discover the Promised Land, and they came across the imprisoned entity known as the Calamity from the Sky, and they thought, it's a Cetra. It wasn't, of course, but they mistakenly believed it was. So they hand the creature over to one Professor Gast, believing that, hey, if it's a Cetra, perhaps it will be their ticket to the Mako-rich Promised Land. Shinra assigned a few other researchers to work under Professor Gast so they could all work together to discover more about this particular creature. The two researchers that we are interested in for this video were Lucretia and Hojo. They gave their new specimen the name Jenova and thus formed the Jenova project, and they all worked together by using cells from the specimen to attempt to create a new race of Cetra. And during their time working together, Lucretia and Hojo became close, they got married, and Lucretia became pregnant with his child. However, Hojo's depravity and sadistic side began to manifest by convincing his wife that they must use their own unborn child as a test subject and begin injecting the fetus with cells taken from the alien specimen combined with Mako from the planet.
Is it true?
Is what true?
That Dr. Crescent is to take part in this project?
It's true.
But using your own child for an experiment?
Ha! I don't know what you're implying, but both of us are scientists. We know what we are doing.
Lucretia was persuaded, and despite the fact that the experiments caused her immense physical and mental anguish, Hojo insisted they were for the greater good, with the hope that the Cetra would be reborn in his own child. And during her pregnancy, Professor Gast went away to discover more about the Cetra and the Jenova specimen by himself. Lucretia gave birth to a son, but Hojo took him away from her immediately in order to observe the effects of the Jenova DNA in his body, and their son was none other than the fabled Sephiroth. And as the infant grew with no knowledge of the Promised Land, he wasn't a Cetra after all, Hojo realised that what he had helped create was something else entirely. Hojo noted that Sephiroth demonstrated immense physical power, and he began to wonder if these attributes could be exploited to create a race of super soldiers for Shinra. He also went on the hunt for Professor Gast, whom he discovered at Icicle Inn, and learned that Gast had fallen in love with a lady known as Ilfana, and they'd had a daughter together, whom they named Aerith. Now, it turned out that Ilfana was actually a Cetra, the last of the Cetra, and therefore so was her daughter. And upon learning this, Hojo insisted that they be handed over to him so that he could continue on with his experiments. Professor Gast refused to betray those whom he loved, but Hojo couldn't really care for Gast's loyalty to his family, and so had him killed outside of Shinra's authority. And he took his wife and child into custody before having them moved over to the Shinra building in Midgar. Now, Aerith and Ilfana were generally kept in a nice room at Shinra, and they were seemingly looked after, but Aerith did have to witness her mother get taken away on many occasions as part of Hojo's experiments. But one day, Ilfana found opportunity to escape with Aerith, and they managed to get away. However, Ilfana was mortally wounded. But before she died, she managed to hand Aerith across to Elmira Gainsborough over in the Sector 7 slums, who promised to look after her and take care of her. In the Final Fantasy VII Remake, Hojo notes that Shinra recovered and returned Ilfana's corpse to him, and the fact that she died meant nothing to him. She was still the last of the Cetra, and he continued to use her body in his morbid experiments.
Did you really think we'd leave such a precious specimen to rot in the gutter? We collected and catalogued every last bit of her.
By this point, Hojo oversaw Shinra's Science Research Division, although it has to be said he had little loyalty to the company outside of where their mutual interest aligned. With Shinra's vast resources available to him, Hojo continued his research with the intention of creating that super soldier army, and he began recruiting naturally strong candidates and exposing them to Mako. The purpose for this was that it would enhance their natural abilities and cause a notable permanent glow within their eyes. And for further experiments, Hojo converted part of the reactor at Nibelheim into a secret lab where he would expose his human test subjects to an even greater concentration of Mako. This would cause them to mutate into grotesque monsters called Machanoids. And incidentally, it is revealed in Final Fantasy VII Remake that Shinra also have a secret underground test site beneath the slums of Sector 7. Further experiments are conducted here with various mutated creatures bearing a striking resemblance to those Machanoids of Nibelheim. And this brings us to about 5 years before the start of the original FF7, and this is where things really do kick off. The Nibelheim experiments were discovered by Sephiroth and a soldier named Zack. Cloud was also with them, though at that time he was only a Shinra infantryman. Whilst inside the reactor, Sephiroth and Zack discover Hojo's grotesque creations, and this sends Sephiroth mad, leading to an event known as the Nibelheim Incident. This leads us to the apparent death of Sephiroth and the capture of Cloud and Zack by Hojo. Hojo decides it's time to put his reunion theory to the test, and this was a theory that asserted that each of Jenova's individual cells have an innate instinct to remain together, so if they are separated, they will seek to reunite and reform the main body. And in order to test this, he begins injecting Sephiroth cells, which share the Jenova DNA of course, into Cloud and Zack, along with a whole bunch of Nibelheim residents. He would also expose these subjects to Mako, but because of course the Nibelheim residents were not as strong as members of Soldier, it didn't have the same effect. Instead, they just descended into madness. These former Nibelheim locals were each individually tattooed with a unique identifying number by Hojo, and he called them Sephiroth clones. Now, despite that label, they were not actually clones because they only had Sephiroth cells injected into them. But the result of these experiments was that these clones, as they were now called, were fully devoted to Sephiroth and Jenova, and literally nothing else mattered to them. Now, to prove his reunion theory, Hojo released these clones, expecting them to instinctively congregate at the Shinra building in Midgar, which is where Jenova's main body had secretly been moved to. As for Cloud, well, his exposure to the Mako put him into a vegetative state, and he stopped responding to any stimuli. Because of this, Hojo labelled him as a failed experiment. Zack, on the other hand, as a member of Soldier, was able to resist the effects of Hojo's experiments altogether, and so he too was labelled as a failure. Hojo abandons them both, but afterwards Zack manages to free himself and Cloud from their containment, with Cloud suffering the effects of extreme Mako poisoning. But as for Hojo, he continues his work, and during the events of Final Fantasy VII and the Final Fantasy VII Remake, Shinra recapture Aerith, and as she is the last of the Cetra, they now call the Cetra Ancients by the way, they handed her over to Hojo. And this is where Hojo's nastiness really shines through. He is concerned that the research required on Aerith would take much longer than her own lifespan, so he cruelly decides to force her to breed with other subjects so that further generations of Cetra could be born. Fortunately, Aerith is rescued by the party and never to be held captive by Hojo again. Oh, and it also turned out that Sephiroth did not die 5 years ago, but instead travelled the livestream. He was now encased in Mako at the northern crater, and he awakens at this time with a will strong enough to take control of the reunion process himself. He takes on full control of the Jenova cells in the Shinra building, breaks the body out of containment, and manipulates the cells in order to take on his own form. With the reunion process now in full force, the main Jenova body, along with all of the scattered clones, begin to make their way north to Sephiroth's actual location. Hojo is ecstatic to witness his reunion theory in action, even though it is not playing out as he expected. Hojo, along with Shinra, follow the clones and discover Sephiroth in the crater, along with the player party, and here it is revealed that Cloud unwittingly was also part of the reunion process, with his instinct to obey the call to find Sephiroth simply fulfilled by his desire in avenging his hometown. Hojo revels in his reunion theory being proven right, and once Sephiroth has the black materia and summons Meteor, the planet responds by calling forth the destructive weapons which proceed to decimate Shinra and apparently kill President Rufus. Not that Hojo particularly cares to mourn for Shinra's great losses, and instead he uses the opportunity for his own gain by taking control of the Sister Ray, which is Shinra's giant Mako fuel cannon, and decides to use that to feed Sephiroth with even greater power. However, Hojo doesn't know or doesn't care about the fact that his intentions will also probably destroy Midgar and tear it apart, so the party parachute in from the high wind in order to put an end to him once and for all. And just when you think you've experienced the pinnacle of Hojo's madness, he never ceases to surprise, and indeed here he reveals to the party that he's even been using his own body as part of his experiments, injecting Jenova cells into his own bloodstream. The result of this is that he mutates into various hideous shapes as the party defeat him in battle and send him into the livestream, pretty much concluding his role in the original Final Fantasy VII. However, this was far from the end for Hojo because, according to the Final Fantasy VII Ultimania Amiga, his evil nature and actions actually prevented him from being absorbed into the planet, so instead he chose to become one with Sephiroth in order to be part of what he would deem his final experiment. But that still doesn't bring us to the end of Hojo's story, because in Dirge of Cerberus, a PS2 game that serves as a sequel and occurring 3 years after the original game, continues to demonstrate his persistence. While his corpse may now be rotting at the console that the party defeated him at, it is also revealed that a digital copy of Hojo's mind had been uploaded to the worldwide network, and this digital version of Hojo possesses a fellow called Vice. And through Vice, Hojo commits relentless genocide, causing the planet to call forth the ultimate weapon, Omega. It turns out that it was Hojo's original intention all along to summon Omega, and having injected Jenova cells into his own body, become one with the most powerful creature that existed. His digital form attempted to continue that process, but was defeated by Vincent Valentine at the end of Dirge of Cerberus, finally bringing an end to Hojo and his destructive causes.
Very, very good. I can only hope you will continue not to disappoint.
So yeah, that's Hojo, and all in all he was pretty bad. It seems the main motivation of his wicked experiments, research and the overall actions of his life were to the end of gaining greater power for himself. He cared about nobody else, not even his own family, even they were not off limits to his cruel experiments. In fact, he regularly took pleasure from the horrors he caused, often laughing at the immense suffering he was inflicting upon others. You know, Sephiroth may have been the main antagonist of Final Fantasy VII, and certainly one of the most famous villains in the whole of video gaming history, and yet even he despised Hojo, his own father, and could not make sense of his evil ways. Of course, the Final Fantasy VII Remake will continue, and how exactly Hojo's role will be expanded upon we do not yet know. But I do think it's safe to predict he will continue to be one of the game's most relentless obstacles to peace for the planet, and I suspect he will play a substantial role in the challenges that await us. So I hope you enjoyed this dive into Professor Hojo's story, and how do you think the remake will continue to expand upon his part in future releases? Please do share your thoughts down in the comments below. I have been Simon from Gamer Guides, and don't forget to check out our full Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VII Remake walkthroughs at gamerguides.com. So have a great day folks, and we'll see you next time.